All right, today we are in Luke 6. We're going to be talking about that fabled passage about loving your enemy. So if you'll turn there with me. So far in Luke, we've seen Jesus being confronted by the Pharisees and the Israelites, lots and lots. And that's kind of going to come home to roost today. So just starting in Luke 6, verse 27. Love your enemies. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you. And from the one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies, and do good, and lend expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Continuing on, judging others. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. For the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Just this far in the reading today. Jesus says, to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. I doubt that there is a command more viscerally hated and concretely impossible than to love your enemies. Hatred is to enemy is like love is to family. Hatred belongs to rapists and murderers, con artists and slavers. Calling the broken to love those who broke them is a scandal like no other. Yet, this is who Jesus is. And I think that Jesus' call in Luke 6:27 is specifically designed to sound impossible. So let's listen to his invitation and soak in this impossibility of this call. Jesus begins his call to be a people of love with an invitation by saying, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. On the surface, this appears as a wish for Jesus' followers to simply act nice to rude people, to give a thumbs up to the person waving their middle finger at you on the Calvary Trail. But this means more than that. This is a call to desire good for people who wish your downfall. That means knowing that someone is actively hoping for your downfall and seeking out your demise, and you wish for their blessing. That's already overwhelming. But this is only the beginning of Jesus' impossible call to love. Next, Jesus suggests that if someone slaps you on the cheek, you turn the other to them also. In other words, when someone abuses you, hits you, does bodily damage to you, offer yourself up for more. I invite you not to immediately walk out, but to squirm with how uncomfortable this sounds for just a moment. I assure you that I feel it too. I don't think that Jesus wants us to endure abuse. but just latch on to the offense of this call to love for a moment. Someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. The final example I have of Jesus' command is, if someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. This command is equally terrifying. Can you imagine someone who robs you of your only shirt, your car, your job, your house, being left with nothing and commanded to give them more? To the heart of this command, if you were to give your tunic to the person who took your coat, you'd be left standing there naked, vulnerable. These commands are unconscionable. They're impossible. This command to love is impossible for us to fulfill. But these impossible commands are piled on with even more impossible commands. Commands like, let them get away with stuff. Just let go of it. Forgive them. Forgive them. Or commands like, give to people without expecting anything in return. That's impossible today. Imagine taking that attitude towards your RRSP or your retirement loan. People would be ruined. Or what about commands like, don't judge, and you will not be judged? I have a friend whose parents never let her sleep over at a particular girl's house, and she never understood why, until recently it came out that her friend's father had molested a bunch of children, including his own. My parents' friend's wrong to judge that person, to exercise judgment and not let their daughter go over to his house? Or maybe are Jesus' rules a little naive? As always, we need to look at what Luke was trying to get across when he wove these teachings of Jesus together. We can get an idea of the kind of people Luke was having Jesus organize through how Luke presents the Israelites to us in this gospel. Contrary to the command to love enemies, we find that the Israelites get off on the wrong foot by seeking to withhold forgiveness in Luke 5 when Jesus heals a paralyzed man. It says, the scribes and the Pharisees began thinking of implications, saying, who is this man who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins except for God alone? Their excuse for being mad at Jesus is unhelpful. Only God can forgive. This is like when you challenge somebody to be more like Jesus and to be more graceful, and they say, well, I'm not Jesus. In fact, it's an exact parallel. The people of God, Israel, are here refusing to act like God. Refusing. Despite being heralds and representatives of God. The Pharisees also judge Jesus in Luke 5, asking, why do you eat and drink with the tax collectors and the sinners? To which Jesus' reply becomes the very thesis of the book of Luke. He says, it is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I've not come to call the righteous to repentance, but sinners. The Pharisees are clear counterexamples of all these commands. Of all Jesus' commands not to judge or withhold forgiveness. Finally, Israel's teachers accuse and curse Jesus for healing on the Sabbath at the beginning of Luke 6. It says, now the scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. The point that I'm trying to make with all these references from Luke is that the kind of people that Jesus is calling to himself are the exact opposite of who God's people, aka Israel, have become. But let's not let this be our getaway free card. This brings us home to the core problem with Israel and with ourselves. If Israel, God's very own chosen people, cannot obey and worship God, how are we going to? How will we? What hope does Peter, a backwater fisherman, and his friends from Galilee have when the religious elite of Israel, educated up to their gills, cannot obey God? But Jesus has answered this already. He answered the hypocrisy of Israel with exactly the kind of love that he's advocating for in this sermon. For example, when the Pharisees begin arguing about whether it's right to offer forgiveness, Jesus does not withhold that forgiveness from the cripple in front of him. He offers it freely, at great risk to himself. When the Pharisees judge Jesus for hanging out with tax collectors and sinners, Jesus still leaves a door open for a relationship with the people who judge him, the very Pharisees who are judging him. And when Jesus is accused of blasphemy on the Sabbath for healing, he does not withhold healing from the Israelites who need it. Despite being perpetrators of judgment and unlove in Israel, Jesus still pours out his love on those very people. This is why he says, "Love your enemies, and you will be children of the Most High. For he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil people. Be merciful, just as your God is merciful." This is the key to the commands that we've been reading about today. These impossible commands. The command to love your enemy is no command at all because we can't do it. But God is love, and he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil people. So the good news today is that even though I am not a loving person, even though I'm not a generous person, God is. And he has drawn near to us in Jesus to alter us into a people who truly are capable of this kind of love. Hear me clearly. If you are saved, if you know Jesus, if you have accepted him in your heart and learned to lean on him like a tree that leans on its roots or a house that anchors itself in its foundation, loving your enemy is possible because God has made the impossible possible in Jesus. But if you can't love your enemies, if you find yourself unable to show kindness to those who have done you wrong and deserve no good from you, have you known Jesus? And don't ask this to condemn anyone, because I would condemn myself. Only to invite you. Perhaps it is time to throw ourselves into God's hands. Perhaps resentment and anger and backbiting have not served you like you hoped it would. I know it hasn't served me. I'm terrified of being taken advantage of. I bounced around from unhealthy church to unhealthy church in my youth, hoping to find a people to complete me. And this left me very vulnerable to people who controlled me with shame. People yelled at me to be a man, treated me with contempt if I cried, and they covered up their own judgment by saying that I needed to stand up for myself better. So it's no wonder that I came to a belief that I had to protect myself by hiding my weakness. People aren't safe. They're actually always searching for my weakness to exploit them. This fear is a sickness, and it creates a defensive pattern in my life. I am judgmental. I am unloving. I accuse and I point fingers in order to hide my weakness and my shame. I fail to admit that I'm weak and act hatefully when someone threatens to uncover my weakness. Like Israel, I seem to have misunderstood God. He is an exacting accountant looking to balance the weight scale of good and bad in my life. But this is not the story of who God is. Jesus beautifully delivers a new story in Luke 6 that I call simply the I-thou reality. Simply put, Jesus wipes away all the politics and the games to say that the person God has put before you is the person that you are called to love. That is the baseline story of reality in Luke 6. This is the truth that we are liberated to live within. This is the truth that sets me free from layer after layer of self-protection. And this is a story that Jesus presents to Israel. God is not an exacting accountant that they have to protect themselves from with obedience. He's love. He's come to draw Israel back into love. And anything that defies this simply is not God or God's people. And this is good news. It means that so much of who I grew to think that God is was false. The God that Israel tried to please with exacting rules was false. And the people who have mistreated you in God's name were false also. Or at least they were just showing bad fruit. The invitation that pours out of this passage is not to double down and try harder to love. We are instead invited to pour our lack into God, who is love, and to be filled with His own Spirit. We are invited to be stripped of our fears about God and others, and to experience life anew. We are invited to see things like they really are. We're invited to spit in the face of people who tell us that this is just the way the world works, by loving abundantly instead. That's our resistance. You might still be wondering, does this mean that I have to take abuse with love? Offer my other cheek, so to say. N.T. Wright offers some clarification to this often misused passage. He says, to be struck on the right cheek in Israel almost certainly meant being hit with the back of the right hand. That's not just violence, but an insult. It implies that you're an inferior, perhaps a slave, a child, or in that world, and even sometimes today, a woman. What's the answer? Hitting back only keeps evil in circulation. Offering the other cheek implies, hit me again if you'd like, but now as an equal, not as an inferior. In this light, turning the other cheek is courageous resistance, not being a doormat. Turning the other cheek is a way of communicating that you're not going to get sucked into their narrative of strength and weakness. It is countering abuse with a different kind of strength that tears down lies, invites you and the other person into a new way of relating with you. It's offering them the other cheek and saying, look me in the eye and do that again. Look me in the eye, not as some inferior that you've dehumanized, as someone also created in God's image. Where does this strength come from? Ironically, from leaning on God, acknowledging that you are weak. The moments where I've acted the most unlovingly, and the moments where Israel has broken the law most deeply, are when they refused to trust God, when we took matters into our own hands. When someone cuts you off in traffic or condescends you about something you care about, even hits you, the temptation is to retaliate in kind. What we are invited to in this passage is to be a people who lean into God's justice, God's generosity, and God's love instead. When we do that, we reveal who God is. And that's exactly what Jesus is up to when he preaches his sermon. Just to be clear, if someone's hitting you, I think it's entirely loving to make them stop. Just to be clear. So hear the good news once again. Even if you are not a loving, generous person, God is. And he is drawn near to us in Jesus to transfigure us to a people who are truly capable of love. Jesus invites you to lean on him, even when you fail. In fact, your failures are the very places where Jesus wants to meet with you, to transform you, to be close with you. Let's respond to this invitation with prayer and let's bow our heads. Jesus, meet us in our fractured loves. Meet us when we fail to love well. Meet us when we've been unloved. Fill up our cups. Fill them until they are overflowing. And your love pours out as a healing torrent for the whole world. We pray this in your name, Lord. Amen.